Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the noise on complex topics and give you the essential takeaways. Today, we're taking a really close look at the recent Israel-Iran hostilities. You might have heard it called Operation True Promise 3, or maybe the 12-Day War. Our mission, really, is to unpack what this conflict tells us about the shifting geopolitical landscape, particularly in the Middle East, but also beyond. We've gone through some really insightful analysis, quite a bit of material, actually, to bring you the different perspectives on this fight, the strategic implications, and, what it might mean going forward.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it, how quickly the narrative around these events has been, well, shaped and developed. We'll dig into the immediate impacts, sure, but
Yeah.
also the longer-term strategies that seem to be at play here, and maybe why this specific moment could be a pretty significant turning point in these regional power dynamics. So the goal is to give you a clear, comprehensive understanding of what's really going on based on the sources we have in front of us.
Okay, let's start with the end of the fighting, or rather the pause, the cessation of hostilities. A lot of people, observers, maybe even some folks in the region, were quite surprised, maybe even a bit angry when Iran seemed to just stop its operations. Especially since, some analyses suggested Israel was really feeling the pressure, militarily speaking, against the ropes was the phrase used, and the U.S. had just attacked Iran directly. So there was this feeling, wasn't there, that Iran should have pushed harder, maybe linked a halt to ending the situation in Gaza, what some sources explicitly call the genocide. What was this pause really about? Was it like a proper ceasefire?
That's a really important question. What was this pause? Our sources, well, they strongly suggest that Iran wasn't actually looking for a massive, drawn-out regional war, something that would just cause immense devastation everywhere. It was a very tricky strategic spot for them to be in. From their perspective, what they seemed to communicate was, okay, hostilities stop if Israel stops too, and if the U.S. backs off its support.
Hmm.
So it wasn't really a negotiated ceasefire in the way we normally think about them, like the ones we've sometimes seen around Gaza or Lebanon. It felt more like a conditional stand-down initiated by Iran itself.
Right, and here's where it gets, I think, really interesting. Some of the analysis we looked at suggests the U.S. just couldn't stomach a full-blown war with Iran. The potential costs were just, well, huge. Closing the Strait of Hormuz, for one, that's a major oil route, but also maybe damage to Donald Trump's image, this idea of him being a peace agent. That seemed to be a factor in some analyses. And it's hard to forget that pretty awful, horrendous, as the source called it, version of the Beach Boys song Bomberan that Trump put out right after things kicked off seemed to just torpedo any idea of genuine peace moves, didn't it?
It certainly didn't help project an image of seeking peace, no. And, if you connect that to the bigger picture, the strategic landscape, for the first time, really, in Israel's history, they now have to genuinely factor in Iran's proven ability to launch direct attacks and to potentially resume them at any moment. So even though there's this pause, the Iranians, according to reports, are kind of celebrating this. They see it as a significant win. Not the end of the war, mind you, but a really critical phase in what they see as a much longer ongoing struggle.
Okay, so if Iran isn't aiming for this big, prolonged war, what's their play here? How are they navigating this? Because on one side, the sources say they claim, they want to follow international law. But on the other, they clearly don't trust anyone. And you can maybe see why, with pretty clear signals from both the U.S. and Israel about wanting regime change in Tehran. For years, really. I mean, that
Yeah.
Bomb Iran song literally mentioned putting the Ayatollah in a box. It's pretty blatant.
It is. And what's really fascinating, I think, is watching Iran walk this incredibly fine line. It's a delicate tightrope walk. Their big picture goals, according to the materials, seem to be about maintaining their sovereignty, their independence very firmly, also supporting regional resistance groups and, crucially, playing a key part in building this multipolar world order, alongside powers like Russia and China, where power isn't just held by one nation. So they've been using negotiations, diplomacy, partly maybe to show they're complying with things like the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the nuclear weapons one, but also fundamentally to protect their own national interests, especially while they're under these really heavy U.S. sanctions.
So essentially, it's about buying time. Is that the core of the strategy?
That's a really good way to put it, I think. It's about gaining time, but not just, surviving day to day. It's about actively developing their capabilities, their military, their economy, everything, so they can withstand future pressure, future aggression, like they feel they did in this recent 12-day war.
Mm.
People sometimes forget this kind of direct state-on-state conflict involving Iran post-revolution is relatively unprecedented, especially in this emerging multipolar context. And the West, well, the sources suggest the West has often seen Iran as perhaps the weakest link among those rising powers.
Hmm. But then you have these U.S. intelligence leaks mentioned in the sources, suggesting Iran's civilian nuclear program wasn't actually destroyed in the attacks, and that this lack of destruction could be used down the line as a pretext for more escalation. It just sounds like the cycle that never quite ends, right?
It really does raise that worrying prospect. You see, if Iran absolutely refuses to give up its civilian nuclear program, which they consistently call a red line, something non-negotiable for them, then yeah, this potential justification, this pretext for future conflict, it just kind of hangs there. It persists.
Okay, let's shift a bit and talk about Iran's actual military muscle here, capabilities. Because the sources suggest that, maybe contrary to some Western assumptions, Iran showed considerable strength. Particularly, its ballistic missile capacity was called very impressive. And interestingly, Iran apparently claimed it didn't even unleash its full arsenal during the fighting.
That's absolutely right. And it's a crucial point that the initial attacks from the U.S. and Mossad actually started inside Iran. We're talking drones, sabotage operations, not big external airstrikes initially. The fact that Iran weathered that, what the sources term an unprecedented act of aggression, and then hit back directly, well, that sends a really strong signal, doesn't it? That these sorts of internal disruption tactics might not be the silver bullet for regime change that some hope for.
Yeah, a strong signal, but not without a human cost.
Yeah.
Definitely. The sources mention over 900 people died in Iran. And okay, while that number might be less than casualties Israel has inflicted elsewhere, say in Lebanon or Palestine and other conflicts, it still points to a really critical vulnerability for Iran, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And it points straight towards a need, probably an urgent one, for Iran to seriously upgrade its air defenses. If there's one major lesson from this for Tehran, it's that their skies are not secure, not by a long shot. Especially when you look at the map, they're surrounded by states like Azerbaijan, Iraq, places that reportedly let Israel use their airspace for these attacks. So that vulnerability, that's definitely going to shape Iran's strategy moving forward, how they regroup, which probably includes deepening those alliances with Russia and China. It's probably no coincidence Iran's defense minister is visiting Moscow right now.
Okay, switching gears now, let's look at Israel. How did they come out of this 12-day war? The analysis we read paints a pretty stark picture. Incredibly damaging was the phrase used.
Yeah, stark is a good word. I think this is a really critical takeaway from the sources. Israel learned, maybe the hard way, that it's not invincible. That narrative took a hit. Unlike maybe previous conflicts where the fight was kept at arm's length, Iran's direct retaliation this time caused immense destruction right inside Israeli cities. We're talking about places like the port in Haifa, military bases, Mossad facilities, even the Weizmann Institute, a major scientific research center. Sources say these were directly hit by Iranian missiles. And that proved, maybe most importantly to Israelis themselves, that they perhaps bit off more than they can chew this time.
Right. So what does that mean for Netanyahu, for Israel's strategy now? It's interesting, the source notes that Netanyahu almost immediately pivoted back to focusing on Gaza.
That's a really fascinating and maybe telling reaction. The analysis suggests Israel is kind of in this mode of desperate expansion. That's the term used. It's feeling increasingly isolated on the world stage, seen as a pariah state by many. Some sources even call it maybe the most unpopular regime in the world right now. And for Netanyahu personally and his current leadership, these kinds of endless wars of expansion, well, the sources argue they're almost necessary for their political survival at this point. It's like they've backed themselves into a corner where stopping means facing potentially humiliating consequences. As one source put it very bluntly, Israel got burned very badly here in the short term.
Okay, let's try and connect this to the bigger international picture. NATO, for instance. Our sources have some pretty strong words for NATO, describing it as basically an appendage of the U.S. A servile son was the metaphor used, someone who just fulfills the wishes of U.S. interests. There was even that anecdote, reportedly, of the former NATO Secretary General calling Donald Trump daddy. I mean, what does that say about U.S. influence and how these alliances function?
Well, it certainly paints a picture of a very hierarchical relationship, doesn't it? What's really illuminating here, though, is the dynamic. The sources seem clear. NATO is largely subservient to U.S. strategic goals, like the goal of weakening Russia via the conflict in Ukraine, which, by the way, the source flatly states is now a lost cause from that perspective. But the relationship between the U.S. and Israel, that seems to be presented as much more complex, more nuanced than just simple subservience.
How so? Because the material we read actually claims the U.S. does ultimately control Israel, not the other way around, which is a common narrative you sometimes hear. It says quite directly if any U.S. administration really wanted to control Israel, it could do so easily. And it even points to Trump giving Netanyahu a severe reprimand during this recent conflict as sort of evidence of that underlying power dynamic.
That's right. And it definitely pushes back against that tail wags the dog idea. However, the sources also argued the U.S. has, maybe unintentionally, created what they call a monster vassal nation in Israel, meaning a state that is subordinate, yes, but one that paradoxically has gained huge influence over American politics, especially as overall U.S. influence in the Middle East perhaps wanes. So, could the U.S. stop military aid? Could it stop providing diplomatic cover for Israel's actions at the UN and elsewhere? Yes, the sources say it could, but it chooses not to. Why? Because fundamentally, Israel serves core U.S. foreign policy objectives. It aligns with these long-term strategic blueprints, things like the Oded Yinon plan.
Right, the one about breaking up neighboring states.
Exactly, from the early 80s. Or the clean break strategy from the mid-90s, pushing for a more aggressive regional posture. So Israel is seen ultimately as a key military outpost for American power projection.
So it's a crucial piece of the U.S. imperial machinery, even if that machine itself is, as the source puts it, aging.
That's a good summary of the argument. And connecting it all up, Israel is described quite vividly as a thread in the aging garment of the U.S. empire. The implication being, it's part of the fabric, yes, but maybe also a point of weakness, something that could potentially unravel the whole thing. And yet, despite that potential fragility, the sources argue that both the U.S. and Israel remain deeply committed. Committed to, and these are strong words, inflicting the maximum amount of suffering and pain on anyone they see as adversaries. This is presented not just as random cruelty, but as a deliberate strategic approach, even if it looks self-destructive sometimes. The idea seems to be that this relentless pressure is necessary, in their view, to achieve their long-term goals, like their objectives in Syria, for example.
Wow, okay. This deep dive has really laid bare just a tangled web, hasn't it? Strategic calculations, deep vulnerability, shifting power dynamics. It's all in play. We've seen how Iran seems to be playing this long game, strategic patience mixed with self-defense, how Israel's image of invincibility has definitely taken a knock, and also the really complex, sometimes contradictory ways the U.S. tries to manage its interests through these key alliances.
It really has, and I think this leaves us, and perhaps you, the listener, with a pretty important question to chew on. Given what the sources describe as this persistent, almost unwavering commitment from the U.S. and Israeli establishments to their strategic aims, even when the costs are incredibly high, what role, if any, do ordinary citizens, people in the U.S. and the collective West, actually have in trying to shape their government's actions on this? Because the sources are quite pessimistic, suggesting this won't end on its own. They explicitly warn against just, trusting Iran to end aggression being carried out by your own government.
Yeah.
So it really pushes us to ask, what can be done? Is there a way to effectively demand and enforce an end to policies that seem to lead, again and again, to such devastating human consequences?